There's a war happening inside you that nobody sees. Not the kind with armies or battles. Something quieter, more devastating. It's the war between who you think you should be and the weight of simply existing without explanation. Sun Tzu said you win by being silent when you act this way. But what he didn't say is that silence, real silence, feels like dying before you've ever lived. Most people spend their entire lives shouting into the void, trying to prove something, justify something, become something. And then one day, the shouting stops. Not because you've found peace, but because you've run out of reasons to keep performing. That moment, that terrible, liberating moment, is where spiritual transformation actually begins. This isn't about tactics or winning in the way you've been taught. This is about the kind of victory that comes from finally stopping the fight against yourself. And it starts in the one place you've been avoiding, the silence where nothing answers back. There's a peculiar kind of suffering that doesn't announce itself with screams or tears. It arrives quietly, like fog rolling into a valley at dawn, and suddenly he can't see his own hands anymore. This is emotional pain in its most deceptive form. A numbness so complete, it convinces him he's fine. But the body knows better. The mind-body connection doesn't lie, even when words do. He wakes up tired, moves through days like he's underwater, and wonders why nothing feels real anymore. Eastern philosophy calls this a disconnection from the Tao, the natural flow of life. Psychology calls it dissociation. Both point to the same truth. He's carrying something invisible, and it's crushing him. The weight of feeling nothing isn't really nothing at all. It's everything he's refused to feel, compressed into a dense, silent mass in his chest. Shadow work begins here, in this gray space where he's too numb to cry, but too aware to ignore the emptiness completely. Carl Jung understood this. The shadow isn't just darkness, it's the unlived life, the unfelt emotions, the parts of himself he buried because they were too painful to hold. When someone asks, "How are you?" and he says, "I'm fine," he's not lying exactly. He's describing the surface of a frozen lake while ignoring the cold, dark water beneath. Detachment seemed like strength once. Now it feels like exile. This state whispers a dangerous lie, that nothing matters, so why bother? But impermanence teaches something different. Everything changes, including this numbness. The very fact that he once felt differently proves feeling can return. Think of a river in winter, frozen solid, seemingly lifeless. Yet beneath the ice, water still flows. The current never truly stopped. It just became invisible. His emotional landscape works the same way. Trauma healing doesn't begin with grand gestures or forced positivity. It begins with acknowledging what's true. I feel nothing. And that feeling weighs more than anything I've ever carried. That simple admission cracks the ice. Self-awareness arrives in strange moments. Maybe he's scrolling through his phone and realizes he hasn't genuinely smiled in weeks. Or he's watching a movie that used to move him and feels vacant. These aren't failures. They're invitations. Buddhism speaks of suffering and awakening as inseparable. Dukkha and bodhi, two sides of one coin. The psychology of pain confirms this. Emotional pain always contains information. His numbness is trying to tell him something. Perhaps it's saying you've been running too long, or something here needs to die before something new can live. The ego dissolution necessary for spiritual transformation often begins exactly here, in this void where old identities stop working and new ones haven't formed yet. He might try to fill the emptiness with work, with noise, with other people's problems, with anything that creates the illusion of purpose. But Wu Wei, the Taoist principle of effortless flow, suggests another path. Stop trying to fix it. Stop performing wellness. Stop pretending the mirror reflects something it doesn't. Meditation and suffering meet in this pause, This radical act of sitting with what is, not to wallow, but to witness. The invisible weight becomes visible only when he stops running from it. And once he sees it clearly, something shifts. Not into happiness, not yet, but into something more honest. The kind of honesty that doesn't feel good but feels real. And real, he's beginning to sense, might be the only way through. Once the numbness becomes unbearable, he does what any thinking person would do. He tries to understand it. He reads books on Buddhism, listens to podcasts about Zen philosophy, scrolls through threads about existential dread at 2 a.m. Why do I feel this way? Becomes his mantra, his obsession, his new religion. He's convinced that if he can just find the right explanation, the right framework, the right spiritual tradition, everything will click into place. Eastern philosophy promises enlightenment through pain, so he dives deeper. Self-awareness becomes his project, his mission. But here's what nobody tells him. Sometimes the search for meaning is just another way to avoid feeling what needs to be felt. He's not seeking truth. He's seeking escape, dressed as wisdom. The mind is a beautiful, terrible thing. It can turn anything into a puzzle to solve, even suffering itself. Jung warned about this trap. The ego's compulsive need to know, to categorize, to control. Shadow work isn't an intellectual exercise. It's a descent into the parts of himself that logic can't touch. But he keeps reading, keeps analyzing, keeps trying to think his way out of what he needs to feel his way through. He learns about karma and rebirth, about samsara and nirvana, about non-attachment and impermanence. The concepts are beautiful, poetic even. They make sense on paper, yet the void inside him grows wider, not smaller. Why? Because he's using wisdom as a shield, not a sword. He's collecting maps but refusing to walk the actual terrain. There's a difference between understanding pain and transmuting it. One happens in the head, the other happens in the bones. Taoism speaks of the uncarved block, the state of pure potential before the mind carves it into shapes and labels. But he's too busy carving, dissecting, naming every shadow that crosses his path. This is childhood trauma, he tells himself. This is attachment theory. This is the ego protecting itself from dissolution. All true, perhaps. All useless if they keep him stuck in his head. Mindfulness, when done wrong, becomes another form of intellectualization, watching his thoughts like a scientist observing bacteria, detached, clinical, safe. But emotional pain doesn't want observation. It wants recognition. It wants to be touched, not studied. Consider the person who reads every book on swimming but never enters the water. That's him right now. He knows the strokes, understands buoyancy, can explain the physics of water displacement. But he's still standing on the shore, dry and safe and fundamentally unchanged. Spiritual transformation isn't an idea, it's an experience. The mind-body connection he keeps reading about isn't a theory. It's the fact that his chest tightens when he thinks about certain memories, that his shoulders carry tension, his thoughts haven't processed, that his stomach knows truths. His mind refuses to speak. Trauma healing begins when he stops asking, "What does this mean?" and starts asking, "What does this feel like?" The first question keeps him circling. The second one drops him into the center. The compulsive search isn't wrong exactly. It's just premature. He's trying to build the temple before clearing the ground. Buddhism teaches that enlightenment comes through direct experience, not through accumulating knowledge about experience. There's a Zen story about a student who asks his master, "What is the meaning of bodhidharmas coming from the West?" The master replies, "The cypress tree in the courtyard." The student, confused, keeps asking. The master keeps pointing at the tree. Meaning isn't found, it's encountered. And right now, he's so busy searching for the answer that he can't see what's standing right in front of him. the raw, uninterpreted, unnamed feeling he's been running from all along. The void isn't deepening because he's searching wrong. It's deepening because the search itself has become the avoidance. Eventually, the books stop helping. The podcasts feel hollow. The search exhausts itself, and what's left is silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the meditative stillness he read about in those Zen philosophy texts. This silence is accusatory, sharp-edged, relentless. It's the voice that speaks loudest when everything else goes quiet. The one that says, "You're not enough. You've never been enough. And now look, even your search for meaning has failed." The ego, sensing its own dissolution, fights back with the only weapon it has left: shame. He sits alone in his room or drives home from work in traffic, and the silence inside him becomes a courtroom. Judge, jury, executioner, all wearing his own face. This is where suffering and awakening collide most violently. Eastern philosophy speaks of ego death as liberation, but nobody mentions how much the ego screams before it dies. It accuses him of wasting time, of being weak, of failing to fix himself despite all the tools he's gathered. Others have healed, it whispers. Others have found peace. What's wrong with you? Shadow work demands he face these voices, but facing them feels like drowning. The mind-body connection manifests here as tightness in the throat, heaviness in the chest, a physical sensation of being crushed by invisible hands. Emotional pain stops being abstract. It becomes the only thing that feels real, a constant gnawing reminder of everything he hasn't become. The silence judges his past, too. Every mistake replays in high definition. That relationship he ruined because he couldn't say what he felt. That opportunity he missed because fear won. That version of himself he promised to become, but never did. Buddhism calls this attachment to past and future, the mind's refusal to rest in the present moment. But knowing the concept doesn't stop the accusations. Impermanence should be comforting. This too shall pass. But right now it just confirms what the silence has been saying. He's wasted the time he had, and time keeps passing, and he's still here, stuck, unchanged. The psychology of pain explains that shame thrives in isolation, that it needs secrecy to survive. But he can't tell anyone about this. How does he explain that the silence inside him is destroying him? There's a particular cruelty to internal accusation. It knows exactly where to strike. It uses his own voice, his own values, his own standards against him. If he values honesty, it calls him a fraud. If he values strength, it calls him weak. If he values growth, it points to every way he's remained the same. This isn't the helpful voice of self-awareness. It's the distorted echo of trauma, of every criticism he ever internalized, every expectation he couldn't meet. Taoism speaks of Wu Wei, the effortless flow, but he's caught in the opposite. Constant effort, constant striving, constant self-correction, and still the silence says it's not enough. The sword he was supposed to forge from his pain has turned inward. He's become his own opponent. Yet something strange happens in this darkness. When the accusations reach their peak, when the silence becomes so loud he can't think anymore, a tiny space opens up. It's barely noticeable at first, just a flicker of awareness that thinks, wait, who's listening to these accusations? There's the voice that accuses, yes, but there's also the presence that hears it, and those two aren't the same. This is the first glimpse of what meditation and suffering have been pointing toward all along. The observer behind the observed, the stillness beneath the noise. He's not ready to trust it yet. The accusations are still too loud, too convincing. But the split-second recognition that there's a difference between his thoughts and his awareness of those thoughts, that's the crack in the armor. That's where light begins to enter, even if he can't see it yet. There comes a moment when even the accusations stop mattering. The inner judge grows tired, the shame loses its edge, and what's left is something far more terrifying than suffering. It's the absence of the will to fight it. This is the collapse, the moment spiritual transformation actually begins, though it feels like the end of everything. He's not sad anymore, not angry, not even numb in that heavy way he was before. He's just done. Done trying to fix himself, done searching for meaning, done pretending any of it matters. Buddhism speaks of ego dissolution, but this isn't the peaceful surrender described in books. This is the ego giving up because it's simply too exhausted to hold the illusion anymore. And in that exhaustion, something ancient and true starts to surface. The collapse doesn't look dramatic from the outside. He still goes to work, still responds to messages, still performs the basic rituals of being human. But internally, the architecture has crumbled. Every identity he built, the capable one, the strong one, the one who has it together, falls away like a mask made of paper in the rain. Trauma healing often requires this complete breakdown before breakthrough can happen. The mind-body connection manifests as a deep, cellular fatigue. Not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that comes from years of holding tension he didn't know he was carrying. His shoulders drop, his jaw unclenches, not because he's relaxed, but because he's finally stopped fighting. Eastern philosophy calls this the dark night of the soul, the valley every seeker must walk through before reaching the mountain. In this space, detachment reveals its true face. He thought detachment meant not caring, staying cool, remaining unbothered. But real non-attachment, the kind Taoism and Buddhism actually teach, is something else entirely. It's not the absence of feeling. It's the absence of the need to control feeling. He spent so long trying to manage his emotions, trying to feel the right things in the right ways, that he forgot how to just let them exist. The collapse strips that control away. Emotional pain flows through him now without his permission, without his interpretation, without his story about what it means. And strangely, paradoxically, this feels more honest than anything he's experienced in years. He's not healing yet, but he's stopped pretending. And that, it turns out, was the first real step. There's a physics to this moment that shadow work tries to explain. Imagine a building that's been structurally damaged for years, held together by sheer will and temporary fixes. Eventually, those supports fail. The building doesn't fall because it's weak. It falls because it was never meant to stand that way. He's been constructing an identity from borrowed materials, using other people's definitions of who he should be, what success looks like, how a person overcomes pain. The collapse happens when those materials finally give out. It's terrifying, yes, but it's also necessary. You can't rebuild on a faulty foundation. Sometimes the kindest thing suffering can do is remove the option to keep pretending the old structure works. Here, in the rubble, something unexpected emerges. Space. Not the empty void he's been running from, but actual inner stillness. The kind that doesn't need to be filled or fixed or understood. Wu Wei, effortless flow, stops being a concept and becomes a lived experience, even if just for seconds at a time. He's too tired to resist what is, too worn down to argue with reality. And in that surrender, impermanence reveals its gift. Everything changes, including this collapse. The person who entered this darkness isn't the person who will emerge from it. Spiritual transformation doesn't happen in the light of understanding. It happens in the darkness of complete unknowing, when even despair loses its strength, and all that remains is the raw fact of existence, stripped of narrative, stripped of meaning, stripped down to something so fundamental it doesn't have a name yet. In the aftermath of collapse, he finds himself in a place he's never been before, a vast, quiet inner space where none of his old questions work anymore. He asks why, and hears nothing. He asks, "What now?" And the silence doesn't even pretend to respond. This isn't the accusatory silence from before. It's something older, deeper, almost neutral. Eastern philosophy has 1,000 names for this space. The void, the gap, the fertile emptiness from which all things arise. But names don't help him now. He's standing in it, and it's not comforting or mystical. It's just there, indifferent to his presence, offering nothing. And somehow, that nothingness demands more courage than any answer ever could. Self-awareness shifts here from knowing himself to simply being himself, without the narrative overlay. The confrontation isn't loud. There are no demons to fight, no shadows with teeth. That's almost worse. He'd know what to do. But this is just space. Meditation and suffering finally make sense in a way they never did conceptually. Every time he tried to meditate before, he was waiting for something: peace, clarity, insight, some kind of reward for sitting still. Now he sits in this inner emptiness and realizes there's nothing to wait for. The space isn't hiding anything. It's not a door to somewhere else. It's just what's underneath everything he's been building on top of it. The mind-body connection becomes palpable here. His breath moves through this emptiness. His heartbeat echoes in it, but neither disturbs it. It's like discovering he's been living in a house built over a canyon, and now he's finally looked down. Buddhism speaks of samsara and nirvana not as different places, but as different ways of relating to the same reality. In this inner space, he glimpses what that means. The suffering wasn't the problem. His relationship to suffering was. The searching wasn't wrong. His belief that searching would save him was. Shadow work led him here, to this confrontation with the parts of himself that have no story, no history, no personality, just existence, raw, unfiltered, undefended. It's uncomfortable because the ego has nothing to grip onto. There's no villain to blame, no wound to heal, no past to rewrite. There's only this moment, this breath, this strange and unsettling fact that he's alive and aware and surrounded by inner space that doesn't explain itself. He might try to leave. The mind is clever. It'll offer new questions, new searches, new ways to avoid sitting in this emptiness. Maybe I need a different approach, it suggests. Maybe there's a teacher, a practice, a book I haven't found yet. But something's shifted. He recognizes these thoughts now as the old pattern trying to reassert itself. Impermanence has done its work. He's not who he was when this journey started. The psychology of pain taught him that avoidance creates suffering. Taoism taught him that forcing creates resistance. And now this empty space teaches him the final lesson. Sometimes the answer isn't an answer at all. Sometimes it's just the willingness to remain present with not knowing, to breathe in the question without demanding it resolve itself into certainty. There's a peculiar kind of honesty that emerges here. Not the confessional kind, not the self-critical kind, but the kind that simply sees what is without adding commentary. He sees his patterns, his fears, his habitual ways of protecting himself from this exact confrontation. And instead of judging them or trying to fix them, he just notices. Non-attachment stops being something he strives for and becomes something he accidentally falls into when he's too tired to grasp anymore. The inner space where nothing answers isn't punishment. It's not even a test. It's just the ground floor of consciousness, the basement level where all the noise stops and what remains is so simple it's almost disappointing. Almost. Because underneath the disappointment, buried beneath the urge to make this mean something, there's a tiny seed of recognition, a whisper that says, this emptiness isn't empty at all. Something shifts when he stops trying to fill the emptiness. Not dramatically. There's no lightning bolt of enlightenment, no sudden clarity that rewrites everything. It's subtler than that. He simply stops fighting, stops resisting, stops trying to make the inner space into something more comfortable or familiar. Wu Wei, the Taoist principle of effortless action, has been waiting for him here all along, but he couldn't see it while he was busy wrestling with shadows. The fight itself was the problem. He's been swinging at smoke, trying to defeat an enemy that had no form, no substance, no actual threat beyond the one he kept creating by believing it was there. Spiritual transformation doesn't happen when he conquers the darkness. It happens when he realizes there's nothing to conquer. This is where Eastern philosophy and the psychology of pain converge into something lived rather than studied. All those concepts he collected, non-attachment, impermanence, ego dissolution, they weren't preparation for this moment. They were this moment, waiting for him to stop understanding them and start embodying them. The mind-body connection becomes obvious now. When he stops fighting, his body responds. The chronic tension in his neck softens. His breathing deepens without effort. His stomach, which has been clenched for months, maybe years, finally relaxes. Not because he's healed, but because he's stopped waging war on himself. Shadow work promised integration, but he thought that meant defeating his shadows. It actually means recognizing that the shadow and the light come from the same source, and fighting one only strengthens both. There's a river metaphor in Taoism. Water doesn't fight the rocks in its path. It flows around them, over them, through them, and eventually wears them smooth. He spent so long trying to be the rock, standing firm against the current of his own emotions, his own pain, his own relentless inner movement. But rocks don't choose their erosion. Water doesn't declare war on stone. Things simply happen according to their nature, and resistance only determines how much it hurts along the way. Emotional pain hasn't disappeared. He'd be lying if he claimed sudden peace. But his relationship to the pain has changed. It moves through him now like weather through a valley. He doesn't take it personally anymore. The storm isn't happening to him, it's just happening, and he's just here. Meditation and suffering reveal their secret in this space of non-resistance. All those hours he spent trying to quiet his mind, trying to achieve some pristine state of inner stillness, he was missing the point. Meditation isn't about controlling thought or banishing discomfort. It's about seeing that the one who's disturbed by thought is itself just another thought. The inner space where nothing answers didn't need his permission to exist. It's been here the whole time, beneath the noise, beneath the searching, beneath every identity he built and watched collapse. Wu Wei isn't passivity. It's not giving up. It's recognizing that some battles were never real to begin with, that some struggles only exist because he keeps showing up to fight them. He begins to notice something strange. The less he tries to change himself, the more naturally change happens. Self-awareness used to be a weapon, a tool for self-improvement, a way to catalog his flaws and fix them. Now it's just awareness. Simple, direct, free from the need to do anything with what it sees. Buddhism speaks of enlightenment through pain, but maybe enlightenment isn't a destination at all. Maybe it's just this, the moment when suffering stops being a problem to solve and becomes a river he's finally willing to let carry him. The shape he was fighting never had a shape. The enemy he was resisting was always just resistance itself. And now, in the strange stillness of letting go, something new begins to move. Not forced, not planned, just arising naturally, the way dawn arrives without asking permission from the night. The first time he sees without story, it's so ordinary he almost misses it. He's looking at a tree outside his window. Nothing special, just branches against sky. And for a handful of seconds he simply sees it. No thoughts about what kind of tree it is. No memory of trees from childhood. No metaphor about roots and growth. Just tree. Just seeing. Then the mind kicks back in with its commentary, its associations. its need to make meaning, but something's been cracked open. He's tasted what perception feels like before the narrative machinery translates it into something familiar, something safe, something that fits the story he's been telling about who he is and what the world means. Eastern philosophy calls this direct experience satori, the unmediated encounter with reality. Psychology calls it presence. Whatever the name, it's new, and it's terrifying in its simplicity. This is where self-awareness completes its transformation. It's no longer a tool for self-improvement or a weapon for self-criticism. It's just awareness, empty of agenda, watching without needing to change what it sees. The mind-body connection becomes transparent here. He notices how quickly thought arises after sensation, how the body experiences something pure and immediate while the mind rushes to interpret, label, judge. A tightness in his chest is just tightness until the story arrives. This is anxiety. I'm feeling anxious. Why am I anxious? What if this gets worse? But in that gap before the story, in that split second of raw sensation, there's something closer to truth than any narrative could capture. Trauma healing happens in this space between stimulus and story, where experience exists without the weight of past or future. He starts noticing narratives everywhere, like seeing the strings on a puppet for the first time. Every emotion comes packaged with a script. I'm sad immediately becomes, I'm sad because, and the story takes over. Childhood, patterns, wounds, all the familiar grooves his mind has worn deep through repetition. Buddhism speaks of karma and rebirth, not just as cosmic principles, but as psychological patterns that repeat until they're seen clearly enough to dissolve. Each time he believes the narrative without question, he's reborn into the same suffering, the same identity, the same limitations. But each time he catches the narrative before it solidifies, there's space, room to breathe, room to choose something different, or to choose nothing at all, and simply let the sensation exist without meaning. Shadow work, he realizes now, wasn't about excavating his darkness and then eliminating it. It was about seeing how he creates darkness through the stories he tells about his experiences. The shadow isn't the unfelt feeling. It's the narrative that makes feeling unsafe in the first place. A child feels sadness, and an adult says, "Don't cry." So the child learns a story. My sadness is wrong. Decades later, he's still carrying that story, defending against sadness with every tool he has, creating elaborate spiritual and psychological frameworks to avoid a feeling that was never dangerous to begin with. Impermanence applies to narratives too. They change, evolve, die. The one who watched his identity collapse in the darkness is watching different stories now. Lighter ones, less rigid, less convinced of their own truth. This new way of perceiving doesn't feel enlightened. It feels raw, undefended, almost childlike. Things touch him more directly now, because there's less padding between sensation and awareness. A song can move him to tears without him understanding why. A stranger's kindness lands differently, heavier and lighter at once. Detachment and non-attachment finally make sense as distinct. Detachment was him building walls against feeling, while non-attachment is letting feeling move through without clinging to it or pushing it away. The inner stillness he read about in all those Zen philosophy books isn't the absence of movement. It's the stable center that watches movement without being swept away by it. He's learning to live there, in that center, even if he keeps forgetting and getting lost in story again. That's fine. The forgetting is part of it. The remembering is part of it. And beneath both, there's simply this: the fact of being aware, prior to any story, about what that awareness means. Integration doesn't arrive with fanfare. There's no ceremony, no moment when he can point and say, "There, that's when I healed." It's more like waking up one morning and realizing he's been walking differently, not straighter, not with more confidence in the performative sense, but with less defense, less justification. He's spent his entire life building cases for his existence, proving his worth through productivity, through being helpful, through achieving things that might finally convince him he deserves to take up space. But something's shifted. He walks now without that constant internal negotiation, that silent argument with an invisible jury. Eastern philosophy speaks of samsara and nirvana as the same world seen through different eyes. He's beginning to understand. The world hasn't changed. His need for it to validate him has simply quieted. The mind-body connection manifests differently now. His body used to be a project, something to optimize, fix, punish, reward. Now, it's just the vehicle through which he experiences being alive. When he feels tired, he rests without the story about laziness. When he feels hungry, he eats without the narrative about control or lack of it. This sounds simple, almost embarrassingly basic, but it represents a seismic shift in how he relates to existence itself. Shadow work promised integration, and here it is. Not the elimination of his shadows, but their inclusion in the full picture of who he is. He's not transcending his humanity. He's finally inhabiting it without apology. The parts of himself he exiled, the feelings he deemed unacceptable, the desires he judged as weak or selfish, they're still there, but they're no longer threats. They're just threads in a larger fabric. Buddhism teaches that suffering and awakening are inseparable, that you can't have one without the other. He used to think that meant pain was a price you paid for wisdom. Now he sees it differently. Suffering isn't the cost of awakening, it's the texture of being human. And awakening is simply learning to stop arguing with that fact. Emotional pain still arises. Of course it does. But there's a lightness in how he meets it now, a flexibility that comes from knowing pain isn't permanent, isn't personal, isn't proof of failure. Impermanence used to terrify him. Everything changes, nothing lasts. What's the point? Now it's almost comforting. The bad days don't last, but neither do the good ones. So he's learning to be present for both, without clinging or resisting. There's a specific kind of freedom that comes with this integration, and it's nothing like he imagined. He thought spiritual transformation would make him special, elevated, somehow more than human. Instead, it's made him more ordinary, more willing to be exactly what he is, without dressing it up in philosophy or psychology or any system that promises to explain him. Wu Wei, effortless flow, shows up in the smallest moments. Washing dishes without making it a meditation practice. Just washing dishes. Having a difficult conversation without scripting it first. Just speaking. Sitting alone on a Tuesday night without needing it to mean something. Just sitting. The mirror he's been avoiding doesn't reflect an enlightened being. It reflects someone who's finally stopped performing for his own approval. Self-awareness has come full circle. It started as a tool for fixing himself, became a weapon for self-attack, dissolved into pure witnessing, and now it's just how he lives. He sees his patterns without being imprisoned by them. He notices when the old narratives try to reassert themselves, the accusations, the shame, the compulsive need to understand everything, and he can choose whether to believe them or let them pass like clouds. Karma and rebirth aren't just metaphysical concepts anymore. They're the daily recognition that he can either repeat the same patterns or step into something new. Integration means both are possible, moment by moment, and neither one defines him permanently. He's walking through his life now, not because he's found all the answers, not because he's conquered his demons, but because walking is simply what happens when you stop needing permission to exist. And that, more than any philosophy or psychology could articulate, feels like coming home to a place he never actually left. So here you are, standing in the space between who you were and who you're becoming, realizing that maybe you don't need to become anything at all. The silence you feared wasn't your enemy. It was the only honest companion you ever had. Every moment you spent running from emptiness, fighting shadows, searching for meaning in places that could never hold it. None of it was wasted. It was the necessary collapse before the rebuilding, the dark night before you learned to see in the dark. Look, I'm not here to sell you some fantasy of eternal peace or enlightenment. That's not how this works. What I'm telling you is that there's a difference between existing and truly being alive. And most people never figure that out because they're too busy defending a version of themselves that was never real to begin with. You've walked through something most people run from their entire lives. You've sat in the silence where nothing answers. You've stopped fighting what has no shape. That takes a kind of courage nobody talks about because it doesn't look impressive from the outside. But here's what matters now. Stop waiting for permission. Stop waiting to feel ready. Stop waiting for the moment when it all finally makes sense. Integration isn't a destination. It's what happens when you finally stop negotiating with reality and just live. The war inside you doesn't end because you've conquered every shadow. It ends because you've realized there was never a war to begin with. Just you fighting yourself in a silence that was trying to set you free the whole time. So I'll ask you this. Can you sit with yourself in complete silence and feel at home? Or are you still at war with the person staring back at you in the mirror? Because if you're still fighting, you'll keep losing. But if you can finally be still, if you can let the silence teach you what all the noise never could, then you've already won. Not in the way Sun Tzu meant, in the way that actually matters. If this hit something real in you, something you can't quite name but know is true, then you need to watch this video next. It'll show you what comes after the silence, what happens when you stop performing and start embodying. It's the next step in this journey, and you're ready for it.